Today, we remember the millions of lives changed forever by the Syrian civil war. March 15th marks a decade since the deadly conflict began in the Middle Eastern nation. Demonstrations broke out today in the rebel-held city of Idlib, which is now protected by ceasefire. It's one of the few areas still holding out against the Damascus government. The war started in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring in 2011. Protests began to demand an end to Bashar al-Assad's regime. Instead of a popular uprising or military takeover, like in other Arab countries during that time, Syrian soldiers fired on demonstrators. The Syrian leader's response kicked off one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Exact data is hard to measure, but the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimates between 387,000 and 593,000 people have died in the conflicts. The United Nations estimates about 6.7 million people have been internally displaced because of the fighting. More than 5 million Syrian refugees are scattered around the globe. I want to bring in CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer now. She joins us from London. Hi, Liz. Great to see you.
Hello.
So you have personally seen the destruction in Syria firsthand. Can you share with us some of the lives you've seen directly impacted by this civil war?
I don't think there is a life in Syria that hasn't been bruised or hurt or changed by this war. Not one person. So you were giving us some of the statistics. The one that sticks out for me is that this country, which was before the war my own personal favorite country in the Middle East, it was hospitable, and it had beautiful food, and it was friendly, and it had a population of roughly 24 million people. So half that population, 12 million people, were forced out of their homes. Half of those who were forced out of their homes are still in Syria, but probably not in the home they were in 10 years ago, and half of them are outside the country. So it's hard to overstate how terribly damaging this war has been. The lives I've seen blighted, gosh, kids who lost limbs playing soccer because there was army shelling, kids who saw their parents killed by either Assad's intelligence forces or one of the rebel groups, families whose houses were just blown up. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of homes destroyed by shelling or bombs. I think the statistic is that 1 in 3 houses in Syria from before the war no longer really exists. So you can, as I said, it's hard to overstate the terrible toll that this war has taken on a people that had previously, granted they were living in a dictatorship, but they had stability, they had enough to eat, and they had homes, and that is just not the case anymore.
And Liz, of course, this was not the only conflict to come out of the Arab Spring. Why has this particular conflict become so much deadlier and longer lasting than the other Arab Spring protests that we saw across the region?
3 reasons, I would say. First of all, a dictator who decided that he was going to stay in power no matter what kind of brutality or cruelty he had to endorse. Secondly, long-running sectarian conflicts and rivalries and dissatisfactions that had been sort of kept on a low simmer by the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad and his ferocious intelligence services. And thirdly, it became the arena where great powers played out great power struggles, and I'm talking about now the countries that decided to come into Syria and battle for influence were the United States, Iran, Russia, and Turkey. So all that together was the perfect storm. And of course, the storm's not over. You know, it's the fighting has largely stopped, and the great powers who are in there are now jockeying for position and influence before this war, it can be called ended. But the problem is that the economy has collapsed now. So on top of war, people are facing real hunger.
Mm-hmm. And Liz, this is a civil war that has been experienced so differently by those who live in Damascus, in the capital, and those who don't. I've met Syrians here in the United States who are from Damascus who insist that the media is getting this all wrong, and that the way that we are reporting it is not the way it is at all in Syria. Can you speak to a little bit of this divide between the capital and the rest of the country?
Well, the capital city is where the presidential palace is. It's where a lot of the money was, the development, the influential people. And Damascus, generally speaking, supported Bashar al-Assad. And as the war went on, people who had been opposed to his government to some extent and wished that he would make some constitutional or democratic reforms stopped criticizing, because they realized that as the country slid into civil war, their best chance at hanging on to stability would be to join the pro-Assad camp. Outside Damascus, things were much more fractured, and it was in the countryside that you saw all the rebel groups, the Syrian Democratic Forces, everybody from them to al-Qaeda to ISIS, they all sprang up in the suburbs around Damascus and in the countryside. So President al-Assad has always had more of a core of support in Damascus and the other cities, in Homs and in Aleppo, and the countryside has always been much more fractured. As for reporting this war accurately, it has been a struggle from the very beginning. We tried to have a team of reporters which was me usually, on the government side, and then we had another team trying to report on the rebel side, and thereby try and present some balance. The trouble was that the conflict got more and more and more complicated, and in the end there was just no way to report accurately on such a multifaceted conflict. And then, of course, the problem became ISIS. We couldn't cover ISIS because they would have killed us. So it has been a challenge from the very beginning, and almost by definition, I think the coverage has been unbalanced simply because reporters could not get access to the whole of the fight, which was becoming mind-bogglingly complicated.
And finally, what is the status now? Does it appear as if there is an end to the fighting in sight?
Well, if you imagine Syria as a sort of a rough rhomboid, the upper left-hand corner there, Idlib, is where a lot of the rebel groups and the people who were opposed to President Assad were sort of herded and shepherded, and that's where they are. President al-Assad has managed to consolidate more or less power and stability elsewhere with the help of Russia and Iran. And it's Russia now that really holds the whip hand. What the Russians decide to do about consolidating the country will probably see the war ended when they make a move. The United States has just under 1,000 soldiers off in the eastern part of Syria, fighting alongside the Kurds. And Turkey is going to try and consolidate its position. You can see as I talk how complicated it is. When the great powers, or the larger powers, decide that the war is going to be over, we'll see some kind of a deal. But there's none in sight. And I mentioned the economic problems. I think the Red Cross is saying that 1 in 6 children has seen or had a parent killed or severely injured. The majority of children in Syria now are food insecure, some of them really malnourished and small and not growing and so on. And so there's a real need to find a deal, but there isn't one in sight, I have to tell you right now. And the United States has got pretty severe sanctions in place that is stopping the Syrian economy from being rebuilt. And while that is in the interest of holding war criminals to account, it's not helping put food in the mouths of Syrian children who are in really dire straits.
Elizabeth Palmer, we thank you for all the fantastic reporting you have done from this region, and we really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for asking.